Hello and welcome back to my channel. I am so excited for today's video because we are doing an individual color study on Quinacridone Magenta. It is such a beautiful color and it has been so long since we have done one of these studies. So I'm taking 8 different colors from my palette and we are going to mix them all with magenta in individual color studies to see all the varieties of color that we get from those combinations. First, let's talk about how to set up these individual color mixing charts. I wanted each square to be 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch. And the way that it's set up is it's 3 rows across the top and 5 rows going down on the side. And so I need 2.5 inches on the sides and 1.5 inches across the top and the bottom. And then that gives you the initial full square. Now we'll make the dots and connect all of the lines later, but I just also wanted to add that my paper is just under 6 by 9, so I was able to fit 8 color charts on my paper, leaving about 1/2 inch between them depending on the direction that they were going. So just do whatever fits your paper, but the general idea is you want the squares all to be the same size. So if you had a really big piece of paper, you could make each of the little squares 1 inch by 1 inch, but this is just the easiest way I have found to set it up. And then once I get the squares created, I go through and I add dots at every 1/2 inch point on all of the lines and then connect them to get the 3 by 5 rectangle. In traditional color mixing and color charting, we're usually only seeing 1, maybe 2 mixtures of 2 colors together, but with this chart we're going to be able to see 5 different mixtures as it goes from each color from the top to the bottom. And then as we go to the right, we are going to dilute those colors with water because we know that value plays a huge role in how a color is perceived. So a really dark blue can actually be very light with a lot of water added. So we're not only going to be able to see all of the different color combinations that magenta can make with the different colors from our palette, but we're also going to be able to see the different variations within the strength of transparency by adding water, which is a very important part of watercolor. If you have any questions about the color charting creation process, I know it can be kind of confusing, please let me know below. I will have all of the dimensions listed in the caption as well. On the left here where I have some extra space, I am titling this study Quin Magenta Color Study, which stands for Quinacridone Magenta. And I am going to be putting an M next to the top row of each of our little color studies. This top row is going to be where all the pure forms of magenta are, and then we are going to put the other color in at the bottom. So the colors we are using for this study are cad yellow, cad red, raw sienna, sap green, Viridian, ultramarine blue, cerulean, and indigo. I'm writing each color down next to a different box so that they will each have their own color mixing chart with magenta. Then I am using a 3/8 inch flat brush, and I'm using this flat brush because it fits perfectly inside the squares, but you could use any brush to fill in the color mixes. So the first thing we're going to do is fill in the boxes that are just pure magenta. So this is pretty easy. The first box is always going to be the thickest, darkest, purest form of the color. And then as we get to the second box, we're going to add more water. So to this mixture we add a little bit of water because this is our more middle value. It has a lot more water and a little bit less pigment, but still just pure magenta. We haven't mixed anything into it. And then this last box is going to be the wateriest, lightest wash. So if you are having trouble getting your wash to be super watery or really light, you can add a little bit more water to that same box after you've even put it down already. You can tap your brush on a paper towel and then go back over it. You just want to be able to represent in your color charting the different variations of the color, so we just need that last box to be the lightest. Now that all the magenta sections are filled, we get to start color mixing, and we're going to start with the upper left corner, which is the cad yellow. we are going to do the same thing that we did with magenta to the cad yellow, which is paint the pure form of the color, but this time it's going to be at the most bottom row of the rectangle. So we're going to start with the very darkest value, go into a more medium wash, and then end up with a lighter wash of color for the very last box. Now for the color mixing. One of my tricks is I like to just bring a little bit of the main color, which is magenta, into the secondary color gradually until we get all of our mixtures. So I already had the bright version of yellow on my palette, and I just took a little bit of that magenta and moved it over, and that gives us the one gradient above yellow. Once we get to the more middle mixture, we need to make sure there's a even mixture as much as possible of the yellow and the magenta together. Another important tip that I have is to use a clean brush to bring magenta over into your mixing area. That way you can mix the yellow with the magenta without contaminating the main source of the magenta. And then I just continue mixing until that top row before the magenta has mostly magenta and just a tiny bit of yellow. And so that's how I'm able to get 3 really different mixtures between those two colors, but we can see a gradient from magenta down to yellow with the light and dark values. And then now we're going to do the same thing with cad red. We're going to put that pure form of cad red down on that bottom row, adding water to create the different values, and then we are going to mix cad red with magenta. Now, there are certain colors like cad red and magenta where there's not going to be a whole lot of variations as much as you try to make sure that the top row above cad red has just a little bit of magenta, that there's a 50-50 mix in the middle. They're all pretty much going to look the same with colors that have a very similar tone. But I think what's really cool about this is that you can see how much the magenta changes the red, especially the closer you get to the magenta. So it's just a great way to know that this very reddish orange color can become a more pinky red and not necessarily a magenta. So it's just really cool to see the variations between adding two colors that are actually quite similar, which might be a color you've been missing or trying to achieve, but you didn't know you just needed these very similar colors to kind of work together to get more of that pinky red. Also, a quick note, if you are having trouble with water control with this exercise, feel free to tap your paintbrush on the paper towel anytime you need to let go of some of that water. It might help you for some of those lighter colors and to feel like you're getting the medium and light values and not just a really strong bit of color and then a big blob of water on your paper. Now we're finished with cad red. Interesting, not too super exciting. And now we're going to move to the raw sienna. Again, we're painting the raw sienna along the bottom, and then we'll continue to add a little bit of magenta to the raw sienna, then a 50-50 mixture, and then more magenta than the raw sienna for that final row. And that's the way I do it. I also like to, of course, wipe my little plate palette that I've got going on so I'm not accidentally adding cad yellow or cad red to these mixtures. But this is the way I like to do it. I hope you feel inspired by this idea to take it however you want to take it. Because really, color studies are for you. Because I have all of these colors in my day-to-day palette. I have this palette sitting on my desk. It's not one I necessarily use all the time. But knowing how these colors react together and then knowing I need a certain color, I can pull these color studies out and use them for my own benefit. So even if your chart is wonky, mine is super wonky, even if the colors aren't perfectly watered down and have the right values, this is just a guide and a way to look at color and mix colors together, and it's for your reference. So use it as an exercise in color mixing and having a way to chart all of the colors you're mixing, but I wouldn't stress even too much about making sure everything's 50-50 or, just a little bit of magenta. Just have fun mixing the colors, do your best, and just learn from the process of adding those colors together. I was really pleasantly surprised by the raw sienna, magenta, moody rose colors that I got. So I love keeping that in mind because I can use the raw sienna more than I typically do to mix with the magenta to get that beautiful moody rose. Now, one of my absolute favorite things to do is mix green with magenta. It always takes everyone by surprise for a couple of reasons. This is sap green, and sap green and magenta are very close to being complementary colors on the color wheel, and complementary colors mute each other and cancel each other out. So when you add a tiny bit of magenta to the sap green, you get this beautiful moody green, almost like an olive green that is just a really wonderful earthy color that I love using in landscapes or for shadows in greenery. Just absolutely beautiful. But it's really fun to mix them at a 50-50 ratio because they turn into this lovely gray brown because they are canceling each other out. So this is one of my favorite ways to actually paint brown is by mixing together magenta, sap green, and maybe a little bit of yellow, and it just gives a really great color palette for that. And then on the opposite end, adding a little bit of the sap green to the magenta gives you a nice, beautiful, moody magenta color. So beautiful. So another maybe surprise, but not unexpected for me because I know complementary colors will do this to each other, but it's really nice to have it color charted in this way so that I can have a visual representation of all the different mixtures between those two complementary colors. Another quick clean of my palette, and then we're moving on to Viridian. Viridian is my favorite mixture with magenta. It is the most surprising. But if you think about what Viridian is, everyone thinks about Viridian as a green. It's very blue. So when you consider how blue Viridian is, it's not going to surprise you the color mixtures that come from Viridian and magenta. So take your guesses now what color you think is going to appear. But I think every single color mixture between Viridian and magenta is so incredibly, insanely beautiful that I want a framed print of just those colors. Because even just adding a tiny bit of magenta to Viridian is the most beautiful, dusty, blue purple color. Insane. Like, I need to paint something with that color right now. And then more of a 50-50 mixture is, you might have guessed it, purple. And it is just such a lovely purple that you cannot get with any other combination. It's this very light, dusty lavender between those two colors. And anyway, it always surprises everyone because they think Viridian is green, quote unquote, which it technically is. But it is such a blue green that we end up with these incredible purples. Like that mostly magenta purple. So good. So good. For me, Viridian is one of those surprise colors that I always keep on hand just to paint with magenta. The next color we're going to use is ultramarine blue. Ultramarine blue I find is more on the warmer side of blues, so I feel like it mixes a lot better with magenta than red. If you've ever tried to mix like the red, blue, yellow color theory palette, red tends to lean more orange, which is the opposite on the color wheel from this ultramarine blue color. So they end up canceling each other out and making very dull purples. But magenta and ultramarine blue make very beautiful purples. More of that pastel violet color we were talking about kind of with the Viridian. I tend not to use ultramarine blue very often because I feel like it doesn't necessarily do what I want it to do a lot of the time. But it is great for mixing cooler shadow colors, especially on buildings. You could even add a tiny bit of cad red to make them a more grayish purple for shadows. That's an example of when you would want a orangey red and ultramarine blue to work together to give you a gray purple shadow versus a beautiful bright purple like this. So you can see that with the magenta shift being on the more pink side, it is creating these beautiful mixtures with the ultramarine blue instead of dulling everything down and making more muddy purples. And this is another example of why doing these color studies is so important with all of the colors on your palette that you use the most often, because you might be someone who uses cad red and ultramarine blue a lot together, but you're frustrated with the purples it's creating, and by doing a color study like this, you can see all of the different purples that you're able to create with magenta and the different blues on your palette. And then you might be able to use that in the future by using it as a reference point. So our next color that we're using is Cerulean, which is one of my favorite blues. I use it all the time. It's the perfect sky blue. And I also use Cerulean as my cyan in my magenta, cyan, yellow color theory limited palette. So it just makes really nice light purples. It gives me a perfect purple every time I need purple. And it gives me that beautiful light blue that you use in skies, in snow, in everything. And it's perfect to mix with yellows to get light bright greens. Anyway, I really love Cerulean. It's my favorite blue to mix magenta with. And this color here is probably one of my favorite magenta colors. So a tiny bit of cerulean into magenta just makes the most beautiful purpley violet color, and I use it all the time when I am painting flowers. It is such a beautiful color, especially in all of the different value levels, adding more water or less water. We're finishing off the color studies with indigo, and I included indigo because it is one of my most used colors on my palette. I feel like indigo can mix with absolutely everything and look amazing for different reasons, and it is one of my favorite ways to get a deep dark purple. You can get deeper, darker colors by adding complementary colors. Like I could mix cerulean and magenta together to get a purple, and then maybe add some orange or some yellow to get a deep, dark purple. But adding indigo is such a great way to make this a very cool, deep, purpley color. And it's funny because after all of the color studies that I did, I found it the hardest to get the right ratio of mixture with the indigo. So you can see that even after I have put it on my paper, I can go back and change it and add different colors just to make sure that this middle one actually is 50-50 and that the one below it was more indigo. So don't worry too much about whether or not the ratios are just right. Even at the end of my whole color study, I was still fiddling with it and trying to get the color just the right way. But isn't this beautiful, deep purple color just insane? It's just insane. And I love using this as an accent color to maybe some of the lighter purples when I am painting a landscape or maybe painting a flower. And that is how you do an individual color study for one color that you want to test out and see how it reacts with all of the colors in your palette. So again, the colors we used are cad yellow, cad red, raw sienna, sap green, viridian, ultramarine blue, cerulean, and indigo. And I just love having a color study based on one color, because then I can see what colors that one color can produce with every color on my palette. And it's a perfect thing to have on my desk for a reference. I hope this was helpful for you and that you take what we talked about today into your own daily practice. Please let me know if you have any questions below, and I will see you next time. Bye.